Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA. First, a word from our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors. Founded in 2004, Affiliated Monitors provides professional, independent integrity monitoring and ethics and compliance assessments nationally and internationally and across almost all industries. With its knowledge of effective ethics and compliance programs and cultures, Affiliated Monitor is respected for its work as the corporate monitor on matters ranging from multinational corporations to small and mid-sized companies and even individuals. Having served in over 750 monitorships, no one has more experience as an independent monitor than the team at Affiliated Monitors. For more information on how an independent monitor can help improve your company's ethics and compliance program, visit our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, at www.affiliatedmonitors.com. Some of this week's top stories are around third-party risk and the FCPA, including high-risk distributors and potentially high-risk employees. What is conscious integrity in the corporate setting? What about cognitive governance in the corporate setting? What is present responsibility and how does it relate to debarment? What are the disclosure and notification requirements when managing a crisis? And have you thought through that beforehand? Why do you need a social media compliance as a part of your ethics and compliance programs? And we take a look at an article on why ethics and compliance still matter. Finally, the Department of Justice comings and goings around employees in the fraud section. Also, a little chat about baseball. Surprise, surprise. This Week in FCPA is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and now a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, along with Mr. Monitor himself, Jay Rosen, for another episode of This Week in FCPA, episode 165 for the week ending August 2, 2019, the Zack Greinke to the Astros edition. Jay, I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Astros hit a home run this week on the trading deadline, where literally at the last minute they obtained Zack Greinke from the Arizona Diamondbacks, and Houston is now the prohibitive favorite to take it back, win the World Series. So I'm going to lord that over you guys as absolutely as long as possible in my own indomitable way. But we actually, other than the Zack Greinke trade, there was some compliance and ethic news of the week. So you want to take a look at that, or you just want to listen to me coo about Zack Greinke coming in to be the number 3 starter for Houston?
Why don't we just jump right into this week's stories, Tom? First off, we're taking a look at FCPA risk and third parties. What does Alexandra Gillis have to say on the FCPA blog?
So Alexandra Gillis, a well-known journalist, sort of in the anti-corruption, anti-bribery, energy, oil space, has written several books around this issue, has an upcoming book, How Oil Corruption Contaminates the World. And when I first saw this, Jay, I was a little, viewed it with a little askance because I thought it was really not realistic. But the more I read what she had to say, the more I thought about it, she's actually making, I think, some pretty good business sense. And her concept or her point was that extractive companies, including energy companies located here in Houston, should they move away from corruption-prone intermediaries? And I don't think anyone disagrees with that statement. But I got to thinking about the larger point, which is actually just moving around away from third-party intermediaries. And now, sometimes you can't do that because it's enshrined in local law that you have to have a third-party intermediary. But I had a really interesting talk with the former chief compliance officer for Baker Hughes once, and his argument, obviously the chief compliance officer, but his business argument to the business was, why would you want to have an intermediary between you and the customer? So why have an extra step when you could have a direct business relationship with a customer? And it really struck me that he was, I think, pretty far ahead of the curve when he first articulated that. But it's a pretty good business point. If you can have a direct relationship with a customer, you're going to have a better overall customer relationship. And I don't think that's rocket science. And Alexandra really, I think, picks up on that thought or that line of thinking. She talks about some of the most recent FCPA enforcement actions and other international anti-corruption enforcement actions, and points to, as almost everyone knows, third parties are still the biggest risk under the FCPA. So I thought it was an interesting point. She's certainly got her own perspective to get across. Nevertheless, when you start thinking about it as a business process issue, it actually demonstrates inefficiency. And if you can bring efficiency to a business process through a compliance solution, I think that's exactly the direction that compliance wants to go and indeed needs to go going forward. So Mike Volkov looked at high-end, or rather high-risk distributors this week. What did you think of his two-part series?
As always, Mike pens excellent stuff, and we link to it in the show notes. This is really an appropriate subject considering what you just spoke about in Alexandra. And what Mike does is he takes a look at the relationship between a company and its high-risk distributor. And he says that while you rely on a network of distributors, it creates its own set of compliance challenges. And as a consequence, a company has to monitor its distributors and adopt proactive strategies to identify potential problems. He goes about and outlines 6 steps and says, assuming we have identified our high-risk distributors and prioritized them on a risk ranking formula, we'll want to focus on the following. Number 1, the definition of the exact distribution chain and reliance on sub-distributors. 2, anti-corruption risk created by the distribution chain and outflow of money. 3, review of transactions for unusual sales or pricing. 4, potential sanctions risk through resales of goods. 5, confirmation of distributors. And 6, confirmation of distributor completion of any compliance requirements. So that's part 1. And in part 2, he builds on the 6 issues and has a general list of issues that are specific to the relationship with a high-risk distributor. Number 1, issue distribution chain and foreign government interactions. Number 2, the outflow of money. Again, compliance should examine the proper use of funds that are given to the company or distributor may be used in that manner. 3, transaction reviews. 4, sanction risks. 5, confirmation training of participation. And then 6, distribution contract compliance. So all this comes to the fact that you were saying before, when you have a third-party relationship or you're one step removed from the end customer, you have to really look at these issues that are created by using a distributor model, especially in high-risk areas. Tom, next up, Shirin Alheiser explains in the FCPA blog what is conspicuous integrity.
Jay, I thought this was a really interesting article and frankly really liked the direction she took this discussion. She talked about countries where there is that are ranked high for the perception of corruption on the TICPI, correctly noting this is the perception of corruption. And she pointed out that in countries that are have a low perception of corruption, if you are asked to pay a bribe, you are less likely to do so. But if conversely, if there's a high perception of corruption in the country, if you're asked to do so, you're more likely to do so. So she really looked at how can you attack a country's perception of corruption within its borders. So this is not looking at, Tom and Jay, 2 Americans doing business overseas. Is not looking at our respective employers or a U.S. multinational. This is looking into the country outside of the United States. And a group called the National Integrity, I believe, the Accountability Lab has built something called the Integrity Icon, which is a program they've created where they go to countries and put on symposia to help promote integrity and show people how they can do this. And it's started in Nepal in 2014. It spread to Liberia, Pakistan, Mali, South Africa, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, and Mexico. And they are getting people to not only understand the dangers and the nefarious effects of corruption, but also how to speak up, raise their hand, and how to resist being extorted to pay a bribe. And I thought this was a great initiative because certainly the FCPA is a supply side law, and but many of the other places across the world, the FCPA really has no legal jurisdiction and it has no applicability for the people who are extorting money and demanding the bribe. So, interesting way to think about the worldwide fight against bribery and corruption and how to do something about it.
Good stuff, Tom. Next up, we have the first of two articles coming from Corporate Compliance Insights. In the first article, James Bone begins a 5-part series on what is cognitive governance. And basically, this is a radical departure from the traditional risk management theory. What Mr. Bone has learned in 10 years of research suggests that risk management is on the verge of a deep renewal and advancement. And the most surprising and commonly cited failure of all risk management is human behavior. Human behavior is cited as the greatest vulnerability in cybersecurity, but it is also the leading cause of fraud, operational, and organizational failure. He takes a look at cognitive governance, and he basically cites 5 disciplines. Number 1, risk governance, separating the duties of risk management and risk assessment analysis. Number 2, perceptions of risks, which seek to understand different views and perceptions of the risks that hinder risk governance. Human element design, which addresses cognitive load, situational awareness, human-machine interaction. Intelligence modeling focuses on business performance, and capital structure concerns risk-adjusted returns on capital. Cognitive governance is designed to expose blind spots and inefficiencies that exist in all organizations that review risk management as a separate and distinct strategy. Instead of starting with an answer like traditional risk frameworks, a cognitive risk framework is centered on asking better questions not yet answered. In order to fully explain cognitive governance, we need to break down the 5 principles of cognitive governance and demonstrate how the rest of the pillars are driven by and informed by its principles. So as we said, this is part 1 of a 5-part series, and I'm sure we'll check back in on it next week. The second article we have from Corporate Compliance Insight is my continuing look at suspension and debarment within the ethics and compliance community. Specifically, this is part 4, looking at present responsibility and its determinations. Every compliance professional should be familiar with the concept of present responsibility, but it's become a bit of a buzzword. It's the underlying basis for action involving excluding a party from the federal marketplace through suspension or debarment. And basically, in the article, I go back and I take a look at the federal acquisitions regulations, and it says that it is the debarring official's responsibility to determine whether debarment is in the government's best interest. The debarring official may, in the public interest, debar a contractor for any of the causes using procedures. This existence of a cause for debarment, however, does not necessarily require the contractor be debarred. So it's a little bit into the minutia, and I probably you do the article more justice by reading it than me talking about it. But this is part 4 within the suspension and debarment series, and I'll wrap that up next week, and then we'll be going on to healthcare for the next 5 parts. So back to you, Tom.
So the next article we have, Jay, is about disclosure and notification considerations while managing a crisis. And last week we talked about our colleague Jonathan Marks wrote about crisis management. And this article, it was a great follow-up to Marks's piece, Jonathan's piece rather, and really drove home that you need to have a plan ready when the crisis arrives, and certainly need to have a plan ready around your disclosures. So there could be mandatory disclosures. Obviously, GDPR in in the EU and in the United Kingdom has a very short window, I believe a 48 or 72 hour window when there must be a disclosure of a data breach. But here in the United States, we've got FINRA, Rule 4530. The CFTC has disclosure requirements, Reg SK for the SEC. So there's several mandatory requirements on that. GDPR, I'm sorry, it's 72 hours, not 48. But there's also other types of disclosure, and that's obviously voluntary disclosure, where you can come in and get credit for making a disclosure. Obviously, in our world, Jay, the FCPA is probably the most well-known around that, but other agencies such as the EPA and now the Antitrust Division have discounts and leniency available for disclosure. There's also disclosures based on some prior resolutions. So does your company have any type of prior agreement with the government which would mandate a disclosure, a DPA, an NPA, a declination, or some other settlement agreement with the department, which would mandate a disclosure? And finally, what about disclosure to commercial partners? Do you have any contract where that's required? And but more importantly, from the business or commercial partner relationship perspective, do you need to disclose the information? So all of these are important considerations. There are different types of disclosures. They may be different types of information you have to disclose, but you need to have a program and process in place to do so prior to the crisis arising. Because if you're trying to figure out who you need to tell that the barn is on fire while the barn is burning, you're probably not going to give that your highest and most intent in attention. Next up, Jay, we have an article from several lawyers at Wachter Liptel about why compliance matters. And I found this a very interesting article. It's certainly broader than simply anti-corruption compliance. And they saw these lawyers see four developments which support this view. The first one is literally in the last 18 months since the announcement of the FCPA corporate enforcement policy by Rod Rosenstein, the government's decision-making process has become much more transparent, and they are using both the carrot and the stick when companies have robust compliance. Obviously, the carrot was the cognizant technology matter, where the company had a C-suite involvement, yet received a declination. But the stick was the Rabobank, where the DOJ insisted on a corporate guilty plea for Bank Secrecy Act and AML violations because the bank had implemented a flawed BSA AML program. Next was the 2019 guidance, the evaluation of corporate compliance programs issued by the Department of Justice earlier this year, and that clearly the department is putting a much more robust analysis on compliance going forward. And then finally, the use of DPAs and NPAs and increased enforcement outside of the United States. We've had a variety of cases where there's been prosecutors from outside the United States have taken the lead on anti-corruption, but also most interestingly, state attorney generals are becoming much more active. And if state attorney generals find state laws which have been broken around certainly international anti-corruption and competitive activities, data privacy, data breach, it's going to, I think, take up the game quite a bit. So it's going to be interesting to see the state AG's role in advancing the compliance ball going forward. So a very interesting article, and we suggest you check it out going forward.
So next up, we have an article from John Horowitz, which is coming to us from the Navix website. And basically, he talks about social media compliance and responding to an employee's disparaging post. The social media revolution has changed the modern workplace in ways that could not possibly have been foreseen. Today's water cooler conversation really tends to happen online. And one of the couple things that he looks at are Section 7 and Section 8 of the National Labor Relations Act and he wonders whether or not social media is protected activity under Section 7. The NLB has broadly defined the terms and conditions of employment, which include but are not limited to wages, benefits, working conditions. The fact, as I said, that the water cooler conversations now occur via social media postings, which can be viewed by members of the public, including customers, does not mean that employers are no longer afforded protection under Section 7. After determining what the employees are communicating about, the second step is to determine who the employer is intending to reach. A single employee may be engaged in protective, concerted activity if he or she is acting on the authority of other employees, bringing group complaints, or trying to induce group action. The best way in dealing with situations like this is to eliminate the reasons why employees resort to social media to make complaints. So to make it easier for internal reporting to have a speak-up culture, develop and implement a balanced social media compliance strategy, and as I said before, create the culture to speak up. Once in place, these steps should ensure your employers are aware of all the channels available to them should they have a problem on the job, including issues with supervisors. Naturally, these types of policies must be supported by a corporate culture of trust where employees feel safe to report and complain. Bad online reviews are not an online problem. They are a real-life problem. And if you own a restaurant, the solution to your bad restaurant reviews is not found online. You solve it in the kitchen. While the law governing social media is continually evolving, fostering an environment where employees feel comfortable expressing themselves to the employer is always the safest harbor.
So with Jeff Kaplan is back, one of certainly our favorite contributors in the blogosphere around ethics and compliance, and he's got the Conflict of Interest blog, and he had a really interesting article which looked at high-risk potential employees. And he took a look at it from kind of the behavioral angle, and he said that it's important to identify high-risk potential employees, not simply those that are high risk, i.e. those who may be dealing with foreign government officials or those of state-owned enterprises, but what is an indicia of a high-risk employee. So he took a look at a few indicia that included employees who may downplay or badmouth ethics during the hiring stage, the very few powerful within an organization. Once you've identified those, take a look at them for their risk-taking behavior, and does it factor into managing employees, promotions, and compensations decisions? Do you have proper training around high-risk employees for specific or risky jobs? And as ethical companies become ambassadors really throughout the, are promoted rather, they should become ambassadors throughout the organization. So a very interesting look at not simply high-risk employees, but those of potentially high risk. Very interesting. And then, Jay, we end with really some comings and goings in the fraud section from Dylan Toker over at the Wall Street Journal Risk and Compliance Journal. You want to tell us about that?
Yep. So Robert Zink will permanently fill a position left in limbo after its former occupant was attacked by the Robert Mueller Special Counsel Office. Robert Zink has now been named chief of the agency's criminal fraud section. The move was announced Monday by Assistant Attorney General Brian Benskowski. Zink was one of two former prosecutors to occupy the position once Andrew Weissman joined Robert Mueller's team. Mr. Zink joined the fraud section in 2010 and was appointed acting chief in January after serving as acting fraud section deputy. The other prosecutor, Sandra Moser, left the position earlier this year to join Quinn Emanuel. We have a couple other comings and goings. Dan Kahn, who until Monday was chief of the section's Foreign Corrupt Practices Act unit, was named as senior deputy, according to Benskowski's memo. Christopher Sotero, an assistant chief of the Foreign Bribery Unit, will serve as the unit's acting chief. And then another newly promoted senior deputy is Joseph Beensterboer, who was promoted from his position as chief of the section's healthcare fraud unit. Mr. Benskowski also cemented the status of the section's strategy, policy, and training unit, where Sally Malloy, who served as acting chief of that section since January, is now the permanent chief. So it seems like with a lot of these moves, Benskowski has really solidified who's doing what, and the organization is in good stead to continue on into the next year. Tom, I understand you are at Season 3 of Star Trek, the original series. What did you talk about this week?
So, Jay, we're either fortunately or unfortunately, I can't tell, we are nearly halfway through the final season of Star Trek. Unfortunately, because that means I'm going to not be able to do them going forward. Fortunately, it's because I won't have to do them going forward. So a daily podcast series sometimes can become overwhelming. Nevertheless, I had some great episodes this week. I started with what I think is absolute worst Star Trek, the original series episode, And the Children Shall Lead. Then Is There No Truth in Beauty? One of my top 3, Spectre of the Gun, and Day of the Dove. And today, posting, looks like here, just in a few minutes after we conclude this recording, we will have For I Have Touched the Sky and the World is Hollow. So I've had a ton of fun doing this. I know a lot of people have enjoyed these. They've been very popular in terms of downloads. So check it out. I think we're probably going to do the movies after this series, and we'll certainly cross-post those on Popcorn and Compliance. Ben Loughlin and I are going to do a series around science and Star Trek. So I just had a ton of fun. I know a lot of people have enjoyed these. Trouble with Tribbles was the #1 download for this series. No surprise there. And then finally, Jay, I'd like to end with really a request to honor a good friend of ours, Doug Cornelius. And Doug participates in a 2-day, 192 annual bike ride called the Pan Mass Bike Ride, which literally rides across Massachusetts from border to border. And he does this to help raise money for cancer. Doug, like most of us, has lost one or more good friends to this disease. He's lost friends who were unfortunately closer to his age than closer to our parents' age. And so, as many of you know, I'm a former cyclist and used to ride in the MS 150. So I can't do that anymore, but Doug can ride, and he does. And he's a great biker, bikes literally throughout the year to work. Big fan of the Tour, as well as I am. Just completed the Tour de France. And so if you would feel like donating some money, I've linked to his donation page. I hope you will join me in making a donation to Doug Cornelius, the fight against cancer, and the annual Pan Mass Bike Challenge. So that really brings us to the end of this episode.
So on behalf of Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist, and myself, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, we'd like to thank you for joining us for this week in FCPA Episode 165 for the week ending August 2nd, the Greinke to the Astros edition. Have a great weekend, and we'll be back with you next week.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have any questions, you can email Jay at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. If you have any questions to me, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Thanks again for listening to This Week, and I hope you'll join us again next week where we take up some of the week's top compliance and ethics stories. This Week in FCPA is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks again for listening.